Some people walk into a quiet room, almost empty, plain walls, a couple of plants, one couch, and something inside them immediately softens. Their shoulders drop. Their breathing slows like they didn't realize they'd been holding it all day. And then someone else walks into that exact same space and feels uneasy, maybe even a little sad, like something important is missing. Same room, same silence, completely different experience. And that difference isn't really about taste. It isn't about style. Minimalism isn't just decoration. In many ways, it's a reflection of how a person is wired. For decades, psychologists have been trying to answer a deeper question: what people actually need to feel psychologically grounded. Not just happy, not just productive, but deeply okay inside their own lives. And one need kept appearing again and again: autonomy. The feeling that your life genuinely belongs to you, that the choices you make, the spaces you live in, even the way you move through ordinary moments, are expressions of who you really are, not performances of who you think you're supposed to be. Because when that sense of ownership disappears, something subtle begins to wear down. You don't notice it all at once. It's quieter than that, a slow friction between who you are and the life surrounding you. People with a strong need for autonomy often start making decisions differently, more intentionally, more aligned with their values, and that includes the environments they create. For them, a minimal space doesn't feel empty. It feels honest. A room with fewer things becomes proof that the environment serves them, not the other way around. Most people never consciously notice that distinction, but for certain personalities, it's impossible not to feel it. And interestingly, that same tendency often appears alongside something unexpected. Many people drawn to minimalism are actually highly sensitive, which sounds almost contradictory at first. When you imagine someone living in a nearly bare apartment, emotional sensitivity probably isn't the first trait that comes to mind, but research keeps pointing in that direction. The sensitivity is exactly why they want less, because they experience more. Environments filled with constant stimulation don't just annoy them. They overwhelm them in ways most people never fully register. For many people, the nervous system filters excess input automatically. Background noise stays in the background. Lights fade into normalcy. Details blur into comfort. But for others, that filter is thinner. More information gets through. More details demand attention. Everything feels louder, brighter, heavier. Psychologist Elaine Aron studied what she called highly sensitive people, roughly 15 to 20% of the population. Her research suggests this trait is largely inborn, stable across a lifetime. People high in sensory sensitivity are measurably more affected by their surroundings. And again, they report feeling better in quieter, less cluttered environments. So their preference for minimalism isn't mainly aesthetic. It's regulation. It's relief. It's the nervous system finally exhaling. It's biological. And once you understand that, minimalism starts to look completely different. Because if this is true, then for some people, minimalism isn't a trend. It isn't a lifestyle identity. They aren't trying to create a certain look. They're building a space where their nervous system can finally relax. Imagine your brain like a phone with a limited battery. Every object that catches your eye, a pile of laundry, stacked books, a blinking notification, clutter sitting quietly in the corner, each one drains a tiny piece of energy just by existing. You're not consciously thinking about them, but your brain is still processing them, still tracking them, still assigning mental resources in the background. A study published in 2011 found something unsettling. When multiple unrelated stimuli compete for attention at the same time, the brain literally loses the ability to fully process any single one of them. Attention divides, and when attention divides, it weakens. Nothing receives your full cognitive power. Your focus fragments, and that fragmentation isn't a personal failure. Some people are simply wired to think deeply. Psychologists call it a high need for cognition, a natural pull toward reflection, analysis, understanding. And people like this often become extremely intentional about shaping their surroundings. Now imagine living with constant mental splitting already running quietly in the background. It stops being a small annoyance. It becomes the difference between a day where thoughts move smoothly and a day where everything feels strangely difficult, even though nothing obvious is wrong. That's why some people become almost protective about keeping their spaces clear. Not because they care about appearances, because they're trying to preserve enough mental space for a single thought to fully exist before something else steals their attention. Writers working at empty desks, artists creating in bare studios, people doing their most meaningful work inside nearly empty rooms. They're not chasing an aesthetic. They're protecting the one resource they cannot replace: uninterrupted attention. Back in 1988, consumer psychologist Russell Belk introduced an idea that quietly explains another layer of this. He called it the extended self, the idea that our identity expands outward into the things we own. Our possessions become symbolic pieces of who we are, whether we notice it or not. Most people slowly build identity through accumulation, adding objects, adding layers, adding proof, until the external picture finally feels complete. But many minimalists arrive somewhere different, sometimes without even realizing it. They begin to sense that an identity built on possessions is inherently unstable. Things break. They disappear. They change meaning over time. So the center of identity shifts, away from inventory, towards something internal, an identity that doesn't depend on objects to feel whole. And for many people, that realization doesn't come gently. It often arrives after loss. After life quietly asks a difficult question: what remains when everything external changes? Which might explain something else. The same psychological wiring that draws someone toward minimalism can also make them more vulnerable when pressure builds. The need for order grows heavier. The sensitivity sharpens, until the feeling becomes unbearable enough that something has to change. And minimalism, structurally, almost accidentally, offers an outlet, a way to reset, a way to reduce the noise when the world becomes too loud. A solution many people practice, without ever fully analyzing why it works. Picture someone 3 days after a breakup. Not the dramatic version, not the collapse, the quieter one. The strangely functional phase where emotions go silent, and they start walking through the apartment holding a trash bag. The ex's belongings go first, then anything connected to shared memories, then objects that simply remind them of how the space used to feel. From the outside, it can look like self-improvement, like someone finally getting organized, finally moving forward. And sometimes it is, but sometimes it's the only way they know to make the chaos inside their chest feel manageable, one cleared surface at a time. Because there's a version of minimalism that isn't really about clarity at all. It's control wearing the appearance of calm. Psychologists call this compensatory behavior. Small, concrete actions you can control used to cope with emotions that feel abstract or uncontrollable. Every object removed creates a brief sense of agency, a quiet confirmation: I still have influence over something. And for a moment, that relief feels real. But small hits of control fade quickly. And when they fade, the urge returns, asking for another reset, another decision, another thing to remove. Over time, the line for what feels like too much begins to move. More things feel unnecessary, then excessive. And eventually, the simplicity that once felt freeing can start to feel restrictive in its own quiet way. Cleaner, quieter, easier to admire from the outside. But something underneath has changed. At that point, the person may not be creating space anymore. They might be creating distance. Distance from grief, from uncertainty, from the version of themselves that existed before everything shifted. Under pressure, the same need for autonomy that usually looks thoughtful and grounded can slowly lean towards something more compulsive. The personality traits themselves don't change. What changes is the weight those traits are trying to carry. And when life becomes stable again, those same tendencies can create something genuinely beautiful, intentional, calm, alive with meaning. Both versions can exist inside the same person, sometimes even within the same week. Minimalism turns out to be far more layered than it first appears. People drawn toward it often feel emotions more intensely. They care deeply about authenticity. They notice the mental cost of overstimulation long before others do. And when life becomes difficult, those sensitivities don't disappear. They redirect. Sometimes that redirection looks like clearing a room because that feels achievable, while facing what's happening internally feels overwhelming. And the deeper question, whether minimalism is an honest expression of who someone truly is, or a quiet way of avoiding something harder, almost never gets spoken out loud. But for the people living inside that question, the answer is usually already there. Waiting. That's all it really asks. A pause. Long enough to notice what's already there. What is your nervous system actually asking for right now? Not what looks good online. Not what an algorithm keeps suggesting. Just your reaction. What happens inside you when you walk into a crowded space compared to an empty one? Does your body tighten, or does it finally exhale? And have you ever slowed down enough to truly hear that response? Because most of us move too quickly to notice the signals guiding us. We adjust. We adapt. We follow expectations so quietly, we forget to ask whether they ever fit us in the first place. But sometimes clarity doesn't come from adding something new. Sometimes it arrives the moment you stop long enough to listen inward, to notice what feels heavy, what feels calm, what feels honest. If any part of this felt familiar, if it helped put words to something you've been sensing but couldn't quite explain, then I'm genuinely glad you were here for this moment. And if you'd like to keep exploring ideas like this with me, subscribing really does help the channel grow. There's also a join button if you ever feel like directly supporting what I'm building here. Either way, I'm glad you stopped. I'm glad you listened. And maybe for a moment, you listened to yourself too.